is this being suppressed in some way? Because it disrupts the narrative of history that we're taught.
Yeah.
In such a drastic way that would make us relook at everything. And that was what led me, again, as I said, to Shuruppak, which then blossomed into a much greater journey and quest that now you're involved in.
We are on the edge of being able to go into a golden age. I truly, absolutely believe that.
Yeah.
And I think that what we're finding with this, and part of understanding the golden age, is understanding where we've been.
Yeah.
So we can understand where in the heck we need to go.
And I found at exactly 42,000 years ago, there was another event that was not quite as severe as the younger and older Dryas, but still a pretty severe event where you get a massive fluctuation in temperature. I think Edgar Cayce was very legitimate.
Yeah, I agree.
And his dating of Atlantis around 50,000 years ago.
Oh, I have a feeling we're going to find so much stuff on this.
Between you and I, Robert, we're going to get to the heart of these mysteries, right?
Yeah, damn straight. Matt LaCroix, what a pleasure to have you here. I'm so excited to have this conversation with you. It was such a pleasure to meet you in Miami a few weeks ago at the Conscious Awards for Forbidden Knowledge. And I've been so impressed. I mean, I know the first time we met was actually at Gaia. And when I was there for filming the Divine Encryption, and you were the host. And I thought you did such a great job. And we were talking in the back, and I was like so impressed with all your work. And I started looking into your work as well. And then your book that came out with Forbidden Knowledge and Billy Carson, and that's just crushed it. So I want to definitely talk all about that. And you've kind of become the resident expert on all things kind of Sumerian, Akkadian, and it's super interesting. And ancient civilization stuff. And now we're even working on a project together, which definitely I'd love you to kind of tell all of our viewers about. But before you do all of that, I'd love to kind of hear how you got into this. I mean, was this something that you as a kid were like, oh my gosh, I one day want to be an archaeologist and study ancient civilizations and find and reveal the wisdom of the ancients? Or was this something that just sort of happened in your life? I mean, as a kid, I was a huge fan of Indiana Jones. I was like, I want to be freaking Indiana Jones, right? That's exactly what I was wanting. And then strangely, my life started moving more and more and more into that direction. So I'd like to hear how it happened for you.
Thanks, Robert. It's great to be here, and I had a lot of fun on the boat talking to you about all the ancient
I'm on a
stuff.
boat, right?
Yeah, we were looking at I guess again the site Ionis that we're going to be visiting, and some of these ancient connections and motifs and symbols. And you were intrigued, and we're talking about it. I'm like, Robert, we really need a polymath, ancient symbols codex expert on this. And you were intrigued, and we talked more. And now, of course, it's very exciting to have you on board as one of the experts that's joining us on that journey. And of course, we'll talk about that as we go along. But you asked about how I got into this and how all this got started. You mentioned Indiana Jones. I had another movie in my time actually that was extremely influential in my path, and I'm sure you've seen it. But Stargate. Back in the day, right? And of course, I loved Indiana Jones a lot too, especially when he's down in crypts and he's exploring and looking for artifacts and things. That was always the part of me that was like, wow, imagine going on an adventure like that and being able to find important artifacts and things that can connect to our ancient past. But we're obviously doing it in a way where we're not trying to plunder it for financial means or anything. We're trying to preserve these secrets for the world. And so I got started on this journey again as a kid, being incredibly intrigued with the ancient world and mysteries and how these things were built. And I had a gap where I went off on the direction of conquering mountains and climbing is the highest things I could possibly do. I'm quite a mountaineer and explorer. And
the explorer part's not surprising, but I mean, what kind of mountains did you climb?
Oh, anything in the region I was living at the time. So I started with climbing the highest peaks and some of the more remote places in Maine and New Hampshire. And then I moved to Colorado and did a lot of hiking in the Rocky Mountains when I was there. And I've done some here as well in California. But for me, the journey started on more of, I guess, pushing the limits of, climbing solo peaks in the wintertime, 13,000 feet, 14,000 feet. It was I felt like I was always trying to conquer something within myself, and I could achieve greater and greater heights doing that. And so a lot of my life I was actually not doing ancient stuff and doing more of hiking huge peaks and going to from very, very remote places and camping and exploring. And I have a whole host of stories that you and I could talk about
Wow.
about dangerous
I
animals.
definitely want to hear this.
Oh
at
yeah,
some
we
point.
have
Yeah,
a lot of-
absolutely. It's funny. I was just I was on Instagram talking with a woman who'd reached out to me and asked me if she could join our next trip to Egypt, and which I also want to talk to you about. But basically, she was able to successfully summit Mount Everest, and I find that so fascinating. It's like, so I wanted to have her on this trip as well, because maybe, that would be a phenomenal thing to share that story, because climbing something like Everest,
yeah,
that's a serious thing.
yes, it is.
And I mean, when you're climbing that thing and you see all the dead bodies that are frozen on the side, it's like, that's got to be pretty
It's
harrowing.
no joke. You're off the beaten path there for sure.
Oh, for sure.
They
So
can't even remove those.
Yeah, I know. There's no way to get rid of them, right? It's like statues at some point. So,
Yeah.
wow.
So that was a big part of my life. I had quite extreme things happen. And again, it's interesting how our lives take these turns and these journeys that help span us in certain ways. I went through situations from, almost getting completely lost and not getting off summits due to massive snowstorms and drifting snow and being like in whiteouts, to potentially almost getting killed from things like rutting moose and things like that. I've certainly had a lot of experiences and things that felt like I had guardian angels on my shoulder.
So you almost got attacked by a moose?
No, I almost got killed by a moose, like legitimately.
They're mean, man.
Well, in rutting season, they become arguably the most dangerous animal in North America. People in Alaska know. You tell them like, oh, are you afraid of those grizzly bears up there? They're like, we're afraid of the moose during rutting season. We certainly don't. They'll just charge right through you and stampede right through you.
What's
They're like
running season? I have to.
Running season is when, I know we're getting off on this now, but I guess I have to mention it.
It's
in
an
the fall. In the fall, before they're gonna mate, the males get a bunch of females and they get territories, and they get extremely territorial, to the point where if you are in a situation near those areas, they can just charge you and kill you. And it's a very serious thing. They're actually very aggressive in the fall. And I found myself in a very remote place alone, camping. And I guess I'll tell you the story.
So they see you as a threat to the herd, like you're going to come and get the females.
You're just a threat in their territory, and they just will stamp that threat out. It's a very
Will they like hunt you down?
Well, I'll tell you the story really quick before we get
Hunted
into the
by a
interesting-
moose, man.
Yeah.
What a way to go.
I was 6.5 miles from my car on a trail, and like a mile from the nearest trail. I had bushwhacked. It's in a very remote place, and I woke up to a terrible noise. Like 5:30, 6 o'clock in the morning, ice everywhere. It was early September. Right about now, or a little bit later than this, but many years ago. And I looked out of my tent, and on the other side of a gravel bar, there was, an 800 to 1,000 pound bull moose with his antlers down, grunting, like charging full speed at me, running at the tent. And unless you're in a situation like that and you can experience it, it's beyond comprehension. They're much larger than a horse.
Yeah,
So you can
huge.
imagine with the large antlers, grunting and charging full speed. I remember, so he comes up and he basically stops a couple feet from me. He's digging his hooves in the gravel, grunting, and I was like, "That's it." That's the end of my life. He's gonna charge over me and take me out. He's very, very aggressive.
And you already knew the danger of moose at that time. Yeah.
And I remember not even being able to speak. It was like you go white in a situation like that. It's like it really is a near-death experience. But that wasn't the end. He ended up backing off after that situation right in front of me, and then doing circles and then bluff charging over and over again, running full speed at you and stopping right before it gets to you. And then eventually I was yelling at him like, "Yeah, get out of here." And
So you weren't running.
well, I was trying to get my stuff together because I knew if I had stayed there, he was going to kill me. I was right in his territory, and every time he would charge, he would be more and more aggressive. It was clearly like get out of here, or something was going to happen. And so I was, picture in the morning, ice everywhere, and I'm throwing all my stuff in my backpack. And at one moment, after he had charged for about the fourth time, This is about 20 minutes, not a short situation. And I was like, at one point, he's not going to stop any longer when he charges. I mean, we're talking feet from you and I. Moose is taller than this room. And I remember he was doing circles, like I was on an island because I was on a gravel bar in a river. And he was circling around me through the woods. It was like being in some movie. It was quite terrifying, actually. And I think it was a big part of what put me in a different path in life. And I'll tell you why. So he was circling, and at one point he had drifted off just a little bit in the distance. You can hear him grunting and breaking trees and stuff. It's like Jurassic Park. It really was, the way they sound in the woods. And I grabbed my backpack and I booked it. And I'm running to try to get back to the trail, and he ends up hearing me and starts chasing after me through the woods. Full run as fast as I can. I'm pretty fast.
The killer moose, man.
And he's coming after me, and eventually I outran and got out of his territory. He kind of turned around at the border or whatever. And I remember getting back to the trail was one of the happiest moments, if not the happiest moment in my life up to that point, because I really thought I was going to die. It was a very, very, it's a situation, unless you're there to experience that. It was a very, very, very much like a near-death experience terrifying, just absolutely terrifying.
Oh, I've been chased I did a 2-week horseback safari in Botswana.
Yeah.
And got chased by 30 elephants at full speed.
So
on a wet horseback with no saddle, because we just crossed the river and with the horses swam and we rode on their backs, and we got in between a mother and its calf.
Yeah, that's it.
And then it was only 15 feet behind us, 30 elephants at full speed.
So you can understand a little bit of
of how
that feels.
At the end of it, I'd never felt more alive in my whole life.
Well, me too. And well, this is the part that connects all of this, though.
Mm-hmm.
There's a really good part that connects this, is that I ended up getting home that morning. I drove back to my dorm. I was in college, Plymouth State University in New Hampshire. I get back and my roommate's still sleeping, right? He's like, he's upset because I opened the door and kind of woke him up. I had just been through that harrowing experience. And I took a shower, cleaned up myself. And I remember the first thing I did was like, I need to write this down or no one's going to believe me. And that is what led me to my writing career starting. It was that experience that I wrote the whole thing down, and then ended up making national newspapers and magazines. It made Backpacker Magazine, AMC Outdoors, a whole number of these national-wide outdoor magazines, and I written about that story, and that was where I began. It started there. But as I progressed in my life, and I was writing about the outdoors, and I actually wrote a book in college called My Wilderness. That's not available anymore, but it was about those experiences, because I had a lot more than just that. I was like, this is crazy. I don't think this is normal. Bears and being on whiteouts on top of mountains and, all these experiences. So that was what started me on writing. But then something pivotal kind of shifted me over. I started reading books about ancient civilizations and ancient history. And then one of them was The Serious Mysteries from Robert Temple, talking about the mysteries of the Dogon with their mysterious understandings of the Sirius star system and their understanding of star constellations and these things. And that was very much a catalyst for me, a catalyst that took off where I was reading that, and I remember thinking to myself, what we're told in school and what we're made to believe about reality and history and about all these things, that disrupted that entire paradigm so much for me that I went on a quest to explore our ancient past and explore these mysteries. And it basically was like this unveiling of a whole nother path for me in life. And I think the best thing to say is not enamored, but probably pretty obsessed with understanding ancient mysteries. And I had a job at the time that was very easy and I had a very quiet atmosphere. And I think that time and having a peaceful place is a underestimated concept in this to think about, is that when you want to understand a lot of ancient mysteries and things that are harder to understand, having a lot of time is critical in a peaceful setting. And that was what I had at the time. And I went down this, they call it like the rabbit hole is probably the best way to say it, as I became basically obsessed with ancient mysteries and was reading everything I possibly could. And that is what led me to not only ancient megaliths and temples and codes hidden within it, but the oldest stories in mankind. You know, the ancient Sumerian and Akkadian cuneiform stories from these earlier time periods that were enigmatic and mysterious, that seemed to not fall into any of the time periods that were taught. And I went on I guess you could call it like a crusade to learn as much as I could about what our history was and the secrets that we once knew that we had lost. And I felt like that was where a lot of those were gleaned from, was those stories. And that's what got me started on all this. I began obsessively studying and reading every single cuneiform tablet possible. But understanding, well, who translated it? Who are the experts that are involved in it? Who are these expert Assyriologists? What's the history behind them? How did they learn how to do what they do? Who can we trust to translate the oldest stories in history? And I'm sure you know, but Sumerian is a language, cuneiform is a writing style, right? When those tablets were first discovered in 1849 by Austin Henry Layard in the ancient city of Nineveh, when they discovered that in the Ashurbanipal library, no one knew how to read Sumerian. They were like, we don't know how to read this at all. And no one alive knew how to read it. That's just the wild thing, is that Sumerian is a language isolate, meaning it doesn't share any characteristics or similarities with any other known writing system in the world, but it's highly advanced. It doesn't even have an alphabet. And that might seem primitive, but it's based on a word association and something that, like the Akur means mountain house. So they have, and that word only means that. The point I'm trying to say, though, is as I was going along on that road, I realized that these stories had secrets in them, secrets that didn't seem to be getting fleshed out very well, that I was incredibly interested in, that has now led and blossomed into connections that I never had imagined, like with you being a part of this documentary and this expedition to Eastern Turkey. It's all connected to that. And there's a thread and a story that leads through this entire thing. And I never had imagined that would happen. I would look at this and say, well, Austin Henry Layard discovered these, but he didn't know how to read them. So who was the ones who translated them? And you find out because it was a dead language and no one in the world knew how to read it.
How old are these tablets?
Well, that's the question. That gets in because number one, is it how old are the stories versus how old are the copies of the stories that they wrote down, right? So if you have
stories might be very, very old. The tablets, probably you can carbon date them pretty accurately.
And so the interesting thing is that most people would think that they're Sumerian tablets, but they're actually mostly Assyrian and Akkadian tablets.
Right.
Because if you were going to tell the story about something disastrous that happened to your ancestors, the ancestors wouldn't be the ones who wrote it. It'd be the culture after that survived it. And so that's what it is they're writing about an earlier time and things that happened. And what I realized was that, well, the pioneer and the unsung hero here that needs to be recognized is a man named George Smith. He was the one who cracked the Sumerian code, we'll call it. And he studied these tablets, hundreds and hundreds and thousands that came out of this library, the Ashurbanipal library. He studied them for years and years and years. And what he did is, the way he cracked the code was that he worked backwards. He realized that he has a dead language you can't decipher. No one alive speaks it. So how do you read it? Well,
and what year was this with George Smith?
This was in around 1878 to 1880. So George Smith realizes that even though Assyrian and Akkadian writes in cuneiform, they're not Sumerians, they share some similarities. Not necessarily always linguistically, but they have some parallels in some of the associations with words and things. So what he did is he went and used Assyrian and Akkadian that had been translated, and he worked backwards. Very painstakingly and slow, putting things like, well, we know this means this, and he worked backwards and he figured it out. And the first tablet he cracked of any of them was the Epic of Gilgamesh. Yeah. The very first tablet. And that's where all of this began.
Which is really the same story in a way. It relates back to the Egyptian story of Osiris, Set, the 12 labors also of Hercules. It's all built into the same, you see essence and flavor all intermingled with this. And it's fascinating because I've spent a lot of time on that as well, that, the Epic of Gilgamesh is actually directly related back to the constellation Orion as well.
Without a doubt, there are different cosmological things woven into that for sure, right? And there are allegorical teachings woven into that, right? But what about what got me particularly intrigued by it was what about the literal things? Like, for instance, we know Gilgamesh was a tyrant king of Uruk, right?
Mm-hmm.
Well, we know Uruk was a real city. So at what point do we blur the lines between myth and legend versus something that really happened? And I'm not saying everything that's in the Epic of Gilgamesh was a literal thing. Not at all. Again, like I mentioned, cosmological and allegorical things are very heavy in those stories. But then there's these moments where I remember being like, thinking to myself, this is a little clue to something that really happened.
Yeah.
I don't know if you remember, right? So Gilgamesh is from a different time period than the Sumerians.
Yep.
He's not from that time period. And when they excavated the ancient city of Shuruppak, which is not Gilgamesh's city, but it's a city, it was the Ziusudra's city, the last Sumerian king priest, right? They found 3 different civilizations that had lived there, 3. And when they found in the second layer, what they called Stratum 2, was the time of Gilgamesh. And they found all the associated different tablets and different writings and different things. But you realize that Gilgamesh was from a different time period. But he was still had connections and understandings from the ancient time period. And if you remember, the story of Gilgamesh is that he goes on a journey, and it's mostly, I think it's mostly a metaphysical journey, but he goes on a journey to find the secrets of immortality. And he goes to the underworld abode, and you see the famous Greek boatman, right? The ferryman that ferries souls across the realms of the living and the dead. And that's where that story is first shown in the Epic of Gilgamesh, is that association we see with going across and going into a different realm. And he goes to visit this ancient Sumerian king and priest named Ziusudra, who is also known as Untapishtim in Assyrian and Akkadian. And so Ziusudra was his original Sumerian name, and he seeks his counsel to find out the secrets of immortality, because you find out that priest and king was the last human to achieve immortality, supposedly, in the ancient world. And the tablets describe that very extensively. But he was seeking him for his counsel, and he says, at this part, I'm paraphrasing, but he says like, "Oh, Gilgamesh, let me tell you a story that is ancient, a story of Shuruppak that's long before you, where the gods once walked in it." He says, "We're once in it." It was very interesting. And then talks about how it was a time before him when there were men and gods that seem to be part of some kind of a demigod, like a higher place. And we see that, of course, with Atlantis and others, and even Egypt, discussing that. But I found that particularly interesting because they're talking about Shuruppak. Okay? Shuruppak was supposed to be a mythical city like Troy. Well, it was in 1931, Shuruppak, Troy being found in the late 1800s, but Shuruppak was found. It was discovered. So you're like, that's the part where I think is the most fascinating, because a lot of academics will say that these stories and these places are based on myth and legend. They're not real. But here we are, this place that's mythical is discovered, and it's a real city. And when they excavate down, I mentioned they found 3 different layers. When they got down to like 14 feet, 15 feet to 20 feet down, they find this massive inundation layer, alluvial layer. Flood layer, okay? That's what they call it. And the flood layer was like 4 to 5 feet thick. And it was completely sterile. There wasn't any human remains or anything. And it exactly matched the stories of a great deluge that had destroyed the ancient world, like what those stories state.
A super prominent part of Epic of Gilgamesh.
Exactly, because that's flood stories in there, right? And he goes to seek the flood hero, Ziusudra, Untapishtim. So we know all that's in there, and we know there's aspects of being real. But what got me particularly interested was that they find Shuruppak in 1931. Way down the bottom, it has all the classic telltale signs of that event actually really happening. Right, a flood layer on top, sterile completely, and then this highly advanced kind of culture in the bottom. We know that because they were building out of things like diorite and other stones that were very hard. Interestingly, Robert, they found a hand sculpted out of diorite stone that had 6 fingers. Very strange and unusual and weird. But that's what they found down there. These pottery and tablets and all these things. But that proved that Shuruppak was real. So when they discovered Shuruppak and it went from myth to reality, you realize there's a real story here. There's truth here to be sought. And that was where I spent the next couple years really focusing and studying this, because the archaeological excavations that came out of the Germans and Americans when they excavated, Schmidt was part of that, Klaus Schmidt, that whole group. When they excavated Shuruppak, they wrote this whole summary about it, okay? And at the end, there's a conclusion that's very extensive where they draw the parallels between the Great Deluge story mentioned in everything from the Sumerian king lists to the Eridu Genesis to the Epic of Gilgamesh to Legend of Itsubar and many, many others. They draw comparisons to that story with what they were finding in the field. Meaning a flood layer that's like very extensive. When they found the Shuruppak layer, it looked like most of the people had abandoned their items or taken them, either abandoned them or taken what they had. It was a mixed match of things they found, but the people seemed to have left in a hurry. Again, like a great event happening. And they drew a lot of these parallels to it. And at the end, they said that it was sort of like a play off of thought. And they weren't really considering that could actually be a real event. But as I studied that, I was like, wait a minute, this paper may be a smoking gun between academics and alternative researchers that we call ourselves, the other side of understanding our past, something that's a crack in between, where academics were accidentally saying like, oops, there may be a lot of truth here. And they kind of spilled it a little bit in that from 1931. And I jumped on that because I realized that it was the only archaeological paper I'd ever read that even made those parallels and connections to something that was almost forbidden, right? Forbidden history that we're not supposed to talk about. Why were these ancient cities buried under such a massive alluvial layer? Like, give you an example, Eridu, the first city, Shuruppak being the last of the first 5 cities, right? There was 5 cities created, they described in the Sumerian king list. And Eridu being the first, I had studied Eridu extensively and was very concerned over the ziggurat, the main ziggurat, their version of a pyramid that had all the ancient temple in the libraries. When it had been excavated in the 1800s and through the early 1900s up through 1960 or 1954, they had never excavated the ziggurat. And I was scratching my head trying to understand how it's possible that a place that was once myth, like Shuruppak, that was found and has this old ziggurat mountain collapsing from deterioration over time, why places like this would be hushed and never excavated and left. And they literally abandoned Eridu after the 1960s and never went back until recently. And it became a situation where I started wondering, like, is this being suppressed in some way? Because it disrupts the narrative of history that we're taught.
Yeah.
And it's such a drastic way that would make us relook at everything. And that was what led me, again, as I said, to Shuruppak, which then blossomed into a much greater journey and quest that now you're involved in, which I never imagined it would lead me to Eastern Turkey, which used to be ancient Armenia. And that's where this whole story kind of takes off, Robert.
Oh, and you don't even know why this is so interesting to me. Because for all the reasons you just mentioned, but, you know, Leonardo da Vinci ended up working in Egypt for 3 years. We found the evidence of this in a letter that he wrote to the Sultan of Babylon. And this was Babylon, Cairo. The original name of Cairo was Babylon. Okay, so talk about forbidden history. And not only that, but as you've seen, I've now identified several maps that have basically shown that to be the case.
Yeah.
That Babylon was actually, in fact, in Egypt. And what's interesting about this is that he wrote this letter, and Da Vinci himself was a Circassian. So his mother was a Circassian slave that they're now finding out was actually a Circassian princess who'd somehow got involved in a scandal and got sold into slavery. Now, the head of the Mamluks, the Sultan of Babylon, was also Circassian. The Mamluks were the bodyguard class. They're all from, this area that's just east of Crimea.
Yeah.
Now, in the story, there he basically writes, he said he was there to study the structure of the great Mount Taurus. The great Mount Taurus is a reference to Osiris and is the Great Pyramid.
Yeah.
Everyone thinks it's Mount Ararat because it's in the Taurus mountain range, right? But then he describes it perfectly. He actually goes into the chamber as well. That's really the king's chamber. And it's perfectly describing exactly what the pyramid experience is.
Yeah.
But he also keeps referencing having gone to Armenia, not Armenia, but Armenia. He actually spelled it wrong. Now, Da Vinci actually did another painting called The Lady with the Ermine. Lady with the Ermine. And it's a woman with sort of reddish, strawberry blonde hair with an ermine, a little white ferret with a black tip tail, right? And this was actually an order called the Hermetic Order of the Ermine. And it was part of the Egyptian mystery schools.
Wow.
Okay.
Do you think that connects back?
Oh, 100%. I know it does.
To Armenia, right?
Yeah. It also connects back to Armenia. So there's more to this story.
Yeah.
Right? Which is like this fascinating thing. Everyone thinks that Da Vinci may have gone to this place called Calindra, because that's what he writes about. It's actually a reference to Ma'adi, which is exactly east of the Great Pyramid Complex and next to the city of Babylon.
Yeah.
And Ma'adi means calendar, Calindra. So, but there's, some people think that was actually southern Turkey because there was a place that was called Kalindaris in that area, but it doesn't connect to the Euphrates River. And the picture he drew of the river and everything that's supposed to be next to the Great Mount Taurus matches perfectly the Nile.
Wow.
Right? Which is actually the Gihon River. So all of this is some sort of strange convergence. And so I want to totally go and investigate what's also happening in Armenia around the same area. And in particular, the places that we're going to be going, which I'm super fascinated by. But another thing that makes me take a pause for a moment is that the things that we had discovered on the walls inside the Great Pyramid, we believe it to be a spiritual ascension stargate, the Great Pyramid itself, that represents the spiritual ascension of Osiris and mankind going through a cycle of a 24,000-year clock.
Yeah.
Where every 6,000 years, approximately, there seems to be a massive flood, deluge, and pole shift of some sort. And if you look at the King's Chamber itself, the shape of the King's Chamber is 2-to-1. So it's 20 cubits long, 10 cubits wide. Why that proportion exactly?
Yeah.
And the entranceway is right in the place where in the cycle and the etchings on the wall matches Aries. So it's the first point you come in. This is actually matching Freemasonry as well.
Yeah.
So I have to go in Freemasonry. They come in this room and like the Holy of Holies room type of thing. And then they end up going around in a circle and then they go back around. So to represent the dual nature of time.
Yeah.
Okay. Now, what's really interesting about this, though, is that in the other two pyramids, when we went to Khafre Pyramid, we noticed, and it was actually my assistant Eden who first discovered it, that there were animals etched all over the walls. And we realized then that the shape of the room and everything else is actually matching the story of Noah's Ark. So the room itself, the King's Chamber, and it's the only sarcophagus that's in the ground. So it's like a bathtub.
Yeah.
It's like a sunken sarcophagus. And so it's like the scene from Noah's Ark looking out all around it where all the animals are waiting to get onto it, right? And so you see all the animals up there, gorillas, lions, bears. I mean, everything is there. Like once you see it, you can't unsee it. And you're like, what in the heck? How was this all missed? Oh my God.
Yeah.
It's been scrubbed over. It's been damaged, no doubt. And then when you go into Menkaure Pyramid, the scene on the walls is actually looks more like a Garden of Eden. There's Tree of Life everywhere, and there's Staff of Hermes everywhere.
Yeah.
Right. And Staff of Asclepius.
Yeah.
Right. But what was really interesting is on one of the walls, on the south wall, underneath the staff of Asclepius and the flaming sword, it looks like it's something from the Garden of Eden, and the flaming sword, and also the ceiling of Menkaure Pyramid has an archway like this, which is also matching the description that showed up in Ezekiel and several other places in the Bible of the Garden of Eden and how it has a tree canopy, and the flower of life has a canopy that goes on top of a river, right? Well, what's interesting about this is that underneath it, you find a very prominent reference. There are 3 Hydra heads, right? So the story of the Hydra is directly in the Epic of Gilgamesh, right?
Yeah.
It's the story of Gilgamesh and Enkidu,
Yes.
right? Where they have
The
to
wild
like,
man. Yeah.
exactly, they have to defeat the Hydra, right? And it's also one of the labors in the Herculean story as well.
Yeah.
So this shows up exactly on that wall, right underneath. It's like the Hydra are guarding the tree of life and the flaming sword,
Yeah.
right? Which is fascinating because then I started thinking, wait a minute. So this is like a mixture of all the stories and maybe there was one story that then broke off into all these different cultural divides.
Like fractals of it almost. Right?
Fractals of it, exactly. But I immediately felt like this is all related to the same story of the same person. And I couldn't figure out which period of time that actually would have been. And maybe it's far more ancient than we think. And that this cycle of 24,000 years is telling us, the four corners of that room are matching the North Sky night.
Yeah.
Where you have Polaris, which is the North Star that we're in right now. 6,000 years ago, it was Thuban, which is in Dracos. 6,000 years before that, it was in Vega, which is in the Lyra constellation. And then 6,000 years before that, the North Star was Deneb in Cygnus, the swan.
Which, of course, we find on Pillar 43 at Göbekli Tepe, which is incredibly interesting.
Okay.
Pillar 43 shows Cygna with Deneb at the top, which has the handbag symbols, the three handbags right above it, which is very interesting.
I'm getting chills right now.
Yeah.
So basically, maybe that's dating.
That's what I've always thought, is that knowledge was handed down during that time period when the North Star was Deneb.
In Deneb.
Yeah. Right?
Oh, I have a feeling we're going to find so much stuff on this.
Between you and I, Robert, we're going to get to the heart of these mysteries, right?
Yeah, damn straight. I mean, that's super exciting. Okay, so keep going. This is like super interesting. So I have not, dived yet into the whole Göbekli Tepe thing and everything, and I've been feeling it calling me in a major way, and so I'm super excited to kind of look into all of these ancient peoples because right now, as far as everyone knows, this is like the most ancient in recorded history. Right?
I think what you're going to visit is older than Göbekli Tepe. And I want to be very clear about that. I think Göbekli Tepe emerged out of that later. It doesn't have the same building style.
I mean, for Deneb to have been the North Star, that would have been 24,000 years ago.
Yeah, and I'm actually potentially dating some of this older than that. And I've done there's a number of reasons why I say that. One, because I don't think the deluge described in these stories is referring to the younger or older Dryas. I think it's talking about a completely different time before that, because we find evidence of this civilization that became part of the Golden Age. I think that built most of what we see that's sophisticated. They succumbed to the younger Dryas and older Dryas catastrophes, and that's what wiped them out. If we're talking about a deluge that led to the emergence of a golden age, we don't find any evidence of that anywhere within the last 12,000 years. If anything, like we went into what's more like an amnesia and a reset, starting over again and losing everything and having to build back up.
Okay, so this is making me think of an entirely different thesis potentially.
Yeah.
And so the thesis that is like coming up, and before I get into it, I'm going to tell you one other factoid. Have you been to Philae Temple?
Not yet.
Okay, so Philae Temple was in southern Egypt. It's close to Aswan. It's a beautiful temple of Isis. It's incredible. It was moved from another location. When they put in the Aswan Dam, they had to move a bunch of stuff.
Then they submerged everything.
They submerged everything. They destroyed several Nubian towns and everything. I mean, and a lot of incredible artifacts and stuff too. Right. So at Philae Temple, though, I noticed, and they put it, to their credit, they put it back together meticulously. Like they literally put it back together. You can't even tell. When you go to Abu Simbel, they move the entire mountain.
Yeah.
Okay. And yet still the sun comes in on the right day and everything. I mean, they really did it meticulously. And how they did it is pretty incredible. These giant statues, they cut them all into smaller pieces and they moved it all, like and Legoed it back together, right? Incredibly. But inside of the Philae Temple, as you go into the entryway, there were these corridors that could go to the right and to the left. As you go under this, at the top of the archway, there's of course a sun disk and everything like you would normally see. And then on right and left side, there were these doors. Well, my friends and I were like, this was back in 2021, we're like, we got to go up inside that thing, right, on both sides. And there was no ladder or anything like that, but it was wide open to the public. So we just climbed up on the inside into like another room that was up in there. You're obviously probably not allowed to go in there, but they probably thought, why would anyone want to go in there? It's just full of bat shit. Because it was full of bat shit.
I'd go in there.
Yeah, exactly. So we went inside there. I videotaped the whole thing in high res. We went inside there, and guess what we found? The walls in those rooms on both sides were covered in petroglyphs of whales. Whales.
Wow.
And I was like, and whales and mermaids, in fact. And it was like, what's with the whales and mermaids? And then we saw trees, but the whales were above the trees. And I was like, wait a minute. And you would see a whole forest that was etched into the wall, like regular trees and everything. And the whales were swimming above the trees. They're telling us how deep the water was. Do you see what I'm saying?
Where like it flooded everything and then the whales were swimming above it.
Yes.
Wow.
Everything was flooded. Everything was flooded.
I think without a doubt that happened.
Yeah,
And
absolutely.
I don't think the whole world was underwater, but I think portions of it were dramatically more affected than others
Yes.
during that.
Mm-hmm.
Because obviously life wouldn't be able to exist if everything was completely underwater.
I believe that this cycle of destruction happens every at least 6,000 to 7,000 years.
Yeah.
And I believe that as we get, sort of like reset, there's a reset.
Yes.
We forget where everything was, and yet we still have some stories that survived. And so then what happens is, this is why there's probably multiple locations around the world that were Nineveh. There were probably multiple locations around the world that were Babylon. Do you see what I'm saying? It's like it gets flooded, and then they end up making the same story exists, the same myth, the same.
It's like Memphis is in the United States, but it's in Egypt. They just mimic the same place somewhere else.
Yes.
Yeah.
I think that's what's possibly happening
Yeah.
here. And I think that's what we're seeing between the sites in Acadia and Sumer versus Egypt. I think what we hear about and we read about in the Bible is a Neo-Babylon, right? For the most part, except for the Genesis account. The Genesis account is directly tied, I think, back to Epic of Gilgamesh.
Yeah.
That entire story.
Yeah.
And so it's fascinating to me because are we just going through this cycle of time that is going through these destructive periods, and then mankind forgets entirely?
Yes.
But we still have the stories that are handed down.
Well, I think that's really where the Kali Yuga cycles come in. The Kali Yuga cycles very much spill that out. How these giant ages, right? The great year, I want to call it 26,000 years. Are you referring to something similar around 24?
Well, the reason I say that is because as we get closer, and I've done a lot of math on this, as we get closer to our sister star Sirius, Sirius A, right? Our gravitational pull increases. As gravity increases, you end up having time speed up.
So that can account for how it's not even on every side.
That's right. So on half the cycle, it's 13,000 years. On the other half the cycle, it's 11,000 years.
That makes sense because aphelion versus perihelion.
That's right.
You're going to have speeding up versus slowing down, but based on as you get close.
Mass time dilation.
Yeah,
exactly.
That makes sense.
And it happens to be exactly a 5, 12, 13 triangle as well. So that gives you 13 times 2 is 26. 12 times 2 is 24.
Yeah.
You've got a 24,000 year cycle. The short end of the cycle is only 22,000 years. The long end of the cycle is 26,000 years.
That makes
sense. The mean
sense.
comes out to 24.
Yeah.
Sri Yukteswar, who wrote the book, The Holy Science, talks about a 24,000 yuga cycle as well.
Right.
Randall Carlson as well.
Yeah, of course.
The 25,920 years is when we're in the far side away from Sirius A. We end up with the 13,000 year half cycle, which then, or 12,960 years.
Yeah, exactly.
And then you end up with 25,920.
Well, it's so fascinating to me that when you look into yuga cycles, though, and you find out that it goes between these very distinctive alchemy times, like we were talking about before, right? The golden age, right? The silver age, the bronze age, and you go back and forth between these different ages, and the ages represent the levels of consciousness and sophistication of that time, right? And it's more, to me, the more I've studied it, and it's gotten down again those depths of the rabbit hole where you're like, wow, so what is governing these ages? Are the great Anuna that we're seeing, these celestial forces related to the creation of civilizations and balance? Are they managing these cycles and allowing human civilization and consciousness to flourish at certain times, and then other times sending us back to the Stone Age and Primitive Age to have to find our way back again? And that's really what it seems has happened here, is that we had a time period long ago, and I'll give you the dating for when I think, because we have to throw that out there. Again, looking at everything from the Temple of Horus and the whole idea of Zeb Tepe and the star alignments in Egypt, versus also like looking at how Eridu was aligned and other ancient cities. What's interesting is you look at when they were aligned to true north. And you look at how, well, they're not anymore. When were they? And you look at when stars were aligned, and you look at climatic events. And what I've found is that I believe the story of the whole Shuruppak and the story of Ziusudra that Gilgamesh is talking about, the reason that he says it's long before you is that it was a long time before Gilgamesh. And I mean a long time. I think that Gilgamesh was around potentially, somewhere like, let's say 6,000 years ago or something like that. I think what we're talking about for the original story is something like 50,000 years ago or 40,000 years ago, somewhere in there.
Yeah.
Because I was looking at ice cores from Greenland, which you can only go 20,000 years because the ice cap wasn't around before that. So then you go to Antarctic ice cores and you look at, because you get a snapshot of a much longer time period. And when I was studying that and looking for climatic events that could match, obviously Younger Dryas and Older Dryas are well established. But what about an event before that to explain the deluge? And I found at exactly 42,000 years ago, there was another event that was not quite as severe as Younger and Older Dryas, but still a pretty severe event where you get a massive fluctuation in temperatures. And I believe that was when...
I think you're going to find it every 6,000 years.
Well, we can explore that 6,000 year paradigm.
Well, I mean, 42,000 would be 7, basically it's 7 times 6. So it's like, I think there's a real chance that you're going to see this cycle over and over and over again throughout history. And I do think the story is much, much older.
Yeah.
And maybe it's all related to kind of a matrix simulation.
I think it's related to even Atlantis. And we can get into that and talk a little bit about Atlantis, because I probably have some new stuff to bring to that people probably never heard of. But the reason I say that is that I think that one of the only, like, just to go a little woo woo for a second, but I think that one of the only channelers I really put stock in was Edgar Cayce.
Yeah.
I think Edgar Cayce was very legitimate.
Yeah, I agree.
And his dating of Atlantis around 50,000 years ago is interesting because it's aligning with a lot of the stuff that I'm exploring with this.
Interesting.
And what I'm exploring, that you're also exploring too, Robert, is what led to the emergence of the Golden Age in humanity. What caused it? What happened? What could have led to civilizations perfecting megalithic structures, having stones so perfectly put together that they seem like they were almost melted and formulated in some kind of a mold? Like one of the locations we're going to be going, we go South America, right? Looking at Ollantaytambo and Sacsayhuaman.
One of my favorite places.
How could they possibly have taken blocks and seamlessly put together in a way where I've had people where I walk, I'm like, hey, look at this wall. Doesn't that look unbelievable? And they're like, that was just a stone cliff that they carved grooves into. I'm like, no, those were blocks they individually put together.
Totally.
And they're like, I don't understand. How could they do that? They're a primitive Stone Age culture. And I'm like, well, that's the mindset that needs to end. But that's what I want to point out here is that when I was exploring the Shuruppak origins, I believe that is what was leading to this beginning of what led to a golden age. And let me explain how. In the deluge stories, it describes how Ziusudra, and again, it's the Noah mythos, but let's take the Noah mythos and keep it there so people don't forget I'm talking about that, but put it aside for a minute. And let's get into what the actual Sumerians and Akkadians say. They don't say it was two of every animal. They don't say that at all. They say that Ziusudra was warned because he was part of a special ancient bloodline, and that his bloodline would become one of the seeds of mankind. That's what it's described as. And that he was supposed to bring his family, specifically his sons, 3 sons, to and his livestock and things
So that's
around them.
matching the Noah mythos.
Yeah, to in his livestock and things around them to survive an event that would basically wipe everything out. And it's described how he had to build it out of this craft out of specific cedar planks and use bitumen, which we still use today, to seal everything. It says like the Absu, totally black and dark, right? Well, that's fine and dandy, and I was trying to figure out where that story went because we don't really find out anything out after that. If you read the Epic of Gilgamesh and like the Atrahasis, they land in the Ararat Mountains, and then the story just kind of ends. But before it ends, it talks about how the Anuna, these celestial intelligences that I think are far more grand and sophisticated than we give them credit for, descend down and meet him, and basically you have this interesting exchange between them where one seems to be playing this role of a destructor in mankind, right, Enlil, and one seems to be playing the role of preserver, Enki. And they get into this argument about how no man was supposed to survive, was supposed to wipe out humanity, and Ziusudra did, and how because he did and preserved the seed of mankind, he's given immortality. And he's the last man to ever get immortality ever again. Like, for instance, there's an obscure tablet that very few people have probably heard of called the Death of Billigames. And Billigames was another name for Gilgamesh. And in that, it describes in detail how Ziusudra, the Noah figure, was the last human ever given mortality, and that never happened ever again, which is why Gilgamesh goes to seek him, okay? Now, that's just filling in the blanks for a second. That's not where the rest of this gets exciting. Where it gets exciting is when I stumbled across these sites in Eastern Turkey. Some of them are brand new, like in the 2000s, and others are a little older that just sort of fell by the wayside and nobody talked about them. There's a site called Shavuz Tepe.
Shavuz Tepe, yeah.
And you're going to be going there,
Mhm, mhm.
okay? You're going to love that.
Mhm.
And at Shavuz Tepe, there's a cuneiform inscription on this spectacular part of these blocks that's remaining, and the rest looks like it was re-put together. And there's these remaining, they're basalt blocks, and they're highly refined, easily the equivalent of the sophistication of any megalithic work anywhere in the world. Their cuts, the precision, like beautiful, right? In that description, it talks about how this site is also called Heikeberg. Well, you learn about ancient Armenian history and you find out that their patron of Armenia, hands down, like who created ancient Armenia, was this demigod king they call King Haik. Okay? King Haik, turns out, was part of who built Shavuz Tepe, along with this god Haldi, who I think was Enki.
Mhm.
What gets fascinating is when you look at the genealogy of King Haik, and you read about the description, you find out King Haik was a direct descendant of the three sons of Noah, of Ziusudra. And I mean, to the point where if anyone's listening to this right now, right, go look up King Haik, their Armenian founder.
It's funny, I just looked him up like last week.
Go look him up just on even Wikipedia, and you'll look at the genealogy sheet,
Mhm.
and you'll see that it's exactly matches being a great descendant of Noah, who they in those biblical and Hebrew bloodlines they call Noah. But of course, we know that figure was originally called Ziusudra or Untapishtim in the Sumerian Akkadian
So how
epics.
many generations down was Haik?
Like 5.
Did you know that there's a new love affair with mathematics and geometry happening all around the world today? People who once despised these subjects in high school are now finding they're falling in love with them. Do you know why? Because math without meaning is simply information, whereas math with meaning is divine communication. My courses, The Etymology of Number and The Language of Light, guide you on a journey of self-discovery, sharpening your problem solving and pattern perceiving, as well as analytical and creative thinking, and unlocking your fullest polymathic potential. And most importantly, acquainting you with the mathematical language of the universe itself. You will never see the U inverse the same again. To get started, I recommend The Etymology of Number, a 4-part series that explores the evolution of numbers and their impact on fields like physics, chemistry, music, and art. It is the embodiment of Leonardo da Vinci's encouragement to study the science of art and the art of science. Learn how to see. Realize that everything connects to everything else. My second course series, The Language of Light, is a 6-part series that builds on concepts from the first course and offers deeper insights into unified sciences, ancient wisdom, spirituality, and their relevance to today. My courses are always fun and easy to understand. They intertwine mathematics, music, art, and consciousness, and illuminate the mathematical connections that span all disciplines of science and art. Register for these 2 courses, Etymology of Number and The Language of Light, at robertedwardgrant.com under the Courses tab. And join the Robert Edward Grant community chat on Orion Messenger for lively, engaging, and innovative discourse. So
he was still a ways down. It wasn't like it was from another time period, because Armenia was created way after what we're talking about.
So what were Ziusudra's sons' names?
Japheth, Shem, and Ham.
That's the same as Noah. Okay, yeah.
Exactly. So that's the sons that were descendants of the Noah mythos.
And Hike was the son then.
It's one of
which line?
Yeah, it's
Ham?
about 4 or 5 down, and it's
Ham?
a descendant of Japheth.
Japheth.
Yes.
Which got Europe.
Yes. Which is where we're exploring, because Japheth is shown, right, Europe is shown as being potentially the proto-creator of the Athenians and Greeks. And that's where we're going to get into this mystery unveiling deeper and deeper, because I have evidence that connect that. So when I saw that, I was like, wait a minute. Hasn't everybody been looking for this for a long time? A connection to, all the Hebrew and ancient biblical stories talk about this. We have traditions throughout the world talking about this. It's well established, and here we have archaeological evidence backing it up. So I was like, it literally was a mind-blowing moment. Having that connection and being like, well, ask your question, Robert, right? You can't have a regular culture create some of the finest megaliths in the world. You have to have a certain level of technological precision, understanding, advanced culture. So why all of a sudden around Lake Vaughan, right? That Chavus Tepe is just one of the sites. Do you have this utter sophistication on a level of anything in the world out of nowhere right there?
Yeah.
Right there. And and then you see the descendants and the bloodlines, and you say, aha, so something really happened here. Now let me go further. Then you have the site Ionis, which is next to it, that was only found in the 2000s. And then you have another one called Kefkalesi. And the 3 of them, and there's others associated as well. In Armenia, there's Erebuni. There's another one called Korzu Castle, and there's one called Altan Tepe that we can talk about too, that I've never revealed or discussed at all yet. So this is new for everyone. But in Ionis, around Lake Vaughan, at Ionis and Kef and Chavus Tepe, there were these mysterious megaliths coming out of there. Designs that seemed to mimic places around the world. Symbols that then became some of the most important symbols of all. And Ionis having what became known as the Knights Templar, or the Red Cross, or the Maltese Cross that we see traveling around the world, seems to have its origins at Ionis, but not in a way where it's simply the first place it was shown. I would go to another step further, Robert. I think Ionis was the place where the Golden Age began.
Okay, now it's interesting you asked the question, what is it? Have you ever seen the television series on Apple Plus called Foundation?
I never watched that, no.
It's a pretty good show. And it's a story that was written by Isaac Asimov, the very famous sci-fi writer. And in the story, it was supposed to have been a civilization like 12,000 years ago, in a galaxy far, far away type thing. And they were coming up to a different, their golden age was ending and they were going into their iron age.
Yeah.
And so there was a mathematician named Harry Sheldon who was an esoteric. So in their culture, math was both esoteric and also, because it was like the language of the universe.
As it should be.
As it should be. So he was kind of like an advanced astrologer, mathematician kind of guy. And he made the prediction, said, look, our whole civilization is going to crash and die.
Yeah, wow.
And what we have to do is we have to leave all of the information into this geometric form.
Code it, right?
Code it into a geometric form.
Yeah.
And that once mankind crawls out of the ashes, they'll be able to find this geometric form, and it'll act as a way to download all the information so that mankind can more quickly climb out of the ashes of its destruction.
And it's like Manly P. Hall said, remember? once humanity learns to read the language of symbolism, a great veil will be lifted to understand what these codes and these symbols and motifs mean, because they can encapsulate entire teachings in a way where you could never write down that, right? You can take symbols, that's what the genius is behind them, and have entire teachings woven into them that are codes. I mean, you're a master of that, codex, right? Codes hidden within them for those who are of a certain consciousness, the adepts, the masters, the sages, who get awakened and see these, and then it unveils a truth to them, an understanding that maybe the average person that just sees it doesn't mean anything to them. And it's the most beautiful way to preserve it, because then only the ones that are ready, the initiates, the ones that are ready for the mysteries to unveil, they will. It's beautiful. What a system, right, Robert?
So fascinating, right? So the structure they leave it in is this cuboctahedron. Now, cuboctahedron is the vector equilibrium. It's got its equidistance from its center to each vertex, right? And you can think of it like this. If you put a square within each of these square sides of this hypercube right here, and you just drew a square that was right like this, and on each of the four sides, that what would be in the center then would be the cuboctahedron.
Yeah.
That's basically triangles and squares. Now, if you flatten that, it ends up as a mod 24 wheel because it has 24 edges.
Yeah.
Now, why does this become important? Because the symbol for the Templar cross and the symbol that we see in Sumerian history, you see it on stelas everywhere and everything, is actually a abbreviation of the knowledge of this 24 cycle, which is what prime numbers are all based off of.
Yeah. And we were talking about that with the flower of life even expanding off
of that. And the flower
right?
of life, it's an abbreviation for the flower of life. It's an abbreviation for Metatron's cube. It's an abbreviation for the knowledge of the higher knowledge of the cycle of time of 24,000 years.
Which is why...
And 24 notes in a scale.
Well, that gets even more fascinating, Robert, is that at Ionis, when you show that specific cross being lowered down, 3 of them, 2 being guarded on either end, and the center one being shown like the totality. I think it's relates to the design of all of reality, balanced life, almost like the pillars of creation too. Everything.
Yeah, it's the codex. It really is the codex.
On either side of those crosses is an hourglass with a sun symbol above it, which I think represents time. So it's fascinating that you say that, because I think that these temples, and of course we're going to be exploring them, you being all the expertise in polymath and sacred geometry and codes within, then we have archaeologists, we have geologists, right? Robert Schoch, geologist, Hans Orheim, we have Lydia de Leon and Arturo, and we have Paul Wallace, a biblical expert. We have all of these experts from every facet that can come in and look at these things and say, what kind of mysteries can we unlock together as a team?
It's going to be an epic show. Can you tell everybody what it's going to be called?
So what we're doing is filming a very, actually a pretty high-end documentary that we're going to hopefully have on Netflix or somewhere like that. We'll figure out, we'll find the best home for it, or the home will come to us. But we're essentially having this whole team, and I believe this is the first time that something like this has ever happened, to go to these sites all around the world that have these mysteries that all connect, and come at it in a fully academic way to investigate them and see if we can literally change the old narrative of history and unlock these mysteries for the world. Now, we are running with a temporary title. I don't know if we're going to end up settling on this title for the documentary. Right now, it's called The Lost Ararat Civilizations, but we'll see what it ends up being at the end. But either way, you're, of course, a huge part of that. And as the organic nature of it, we're going to these places and we're all exploring them with our expertise, and we're giving analysis and commentary and measuring everything and testing it all and seeing what we can connect to all of this. Because I think what we end up unlocking here is pivotal to our understanding right now. Maybe even the type of pivotal and its significance that having all these minds together, like you, Robert, is we unlock this aspect of knowledge, this higher knowledge that humanity needs to reach the next golden age.
Yeah, it's almost like what got us here won't get us there. So we need some sort of new download of information, like the software. You know, it's like I'm waiting for our iOS to show up and say iOS 17.6 is now available. Right? It's like there needs to be like a new 100th monkey effect for mankind. I feel like, because we're definitely seeing our society in decline in a massive way right now.
Yeah.
Infrastructure, everything seems to be falling apart at the seams. And, I wouldn't be surprised. I just watched a podcast with a friend of mine with Chris Williamson. His name is Eric Weinstein. And Eric, the whole title of the podcast was, are we basically on the brink of a revolution?
Yeah, exactly.
And I think we are. On the way here, I was just watching a video that was posted by Tulsi Gabbard, how the TSA had been weaponized against her because she left the Democratic Party, and that she was put on the terrorist list, so that every time she goes to the airport, she gets hassled. Hassled like crazy, like it's like completely treated like crap. And it was like a horrific thing for her. And then whistleblowers came out of TSA and told the whole story.
Yeah.
Which is like, what is this?
Well, it's
the same thing. It happened to me too. I was involved on a campaign team, and immediately after being involved on a campaign team, me and every other person who was involved in that campaign team, who lost anyway, right, all got audited by the IRS.
Well, that's why I don't want to get on that list, Robert. But hopefully I don't.
It's like I'm not in politics anymore. But that was a while back. But the fact is, like, this should not be.
Well, that's what happens when empires transition into something new.
It's time for one thing. I just got back from Burning Man. Okay, and one of the things that was the best thing about Burning Man is I realized we don't need fucking government.
We need a model that certainly gives more people empowerment to be a part of their community and be part of their world, and to do, I think, things that are related to things they want to contribute to help something greater.
I tell you what, it was amazing to me. And I've been a student of philosophy, a student of Plato's Republic. I've read it all. I can tell you right now, and I believe we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they're endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, and among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness.
Yes.
Okay? And to ensure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. We've lost the consent aspect of it.
Yeah.
It's become totalitarian. It's become control-oriented. It's time for humanity, I believe, to ascend to its own sovereignty. And what you see at Burning Man, and that's why I really think you should go next year, because, it's difficult to deal with the dust. Yeah, there's no doubt. It's like there's dust in everything. But it's kind of ashes to ashes, dust to dust. It feels like the ending is the beginning and the beginning is the ending type of a place. And there's something about this healing nature of what people refer to as the healing nature of the playa. And I didn't understand that. It's a gigantic dust bowl. I mean, you can imagine.
Bed, right? It's an ancient lake bed.
Yeah. And basically it's like, if you can imagine, it's like dust and ash.
Yeah.
The whole thing. It's the finest dust you've ever seen. And it's like the stuff that accumulates in the bottom of your fireplace.
Yeah.
Imagine that. You get it wet, it's like the stickiest stuff ever. Like you can't do anything with that. It's just like clay. You could probably sculpt with this stuff. No joke. You could probably be a sculptor.
Well, it probably has a high clay content. That's probably why.
It has a huge clay content as well. But the point is this, that what I noticed is that everyone there was so kind. There was no money transacted anywhere.
Yeah.
It was all out of love and gifting. So I'd be riding my bike along somewhere, and everything's on bikes and like electric bikes. I'd be riding my bike along somewhere, and this is the place that comes out of the desert, out of nowhere, where no one should live and no one should survive. And somehow the whole thing becomes a thriving metropolis, like overnight, right? Within a couple of days. And it's fascinating just from that perspective, because there's no energy out there. There's no nothing. How do you bring all this stuff in, right? There's nothing to plug into in the first place. So you got to have generators and all that. But what's interesting is that you'll be riding along and someone will just stop and say, would you like some cold water? And they hand it to you.
Yeah.
And it's just all a gift.
Feels like a different world, doesn't it?
I must have gotten 30 gifts from people. Some of them came to see my talks and stuff, because I gave 3 talks while I was there. And the only kind of governance that there was like the Rangers. And on the last day, I was asking the Rangers, how do I get a bus to the airport? And not a single one of them could tell me, which was like, what?
Yeah.
But there was no need for all this administration and government. And each camp ran very autonomously as well. And yet there's nothing left behind. They have a very clear ethos on what's allowed and what's not allowed from the perspective of, this is what we believe in. There's sort of like, all of the the 10 commandments, I guess you could say, of Burning Man. But it is, leave no trace is one of their big things. It was really fascinating to see what it's like and what can happen and the creativity that comes out of not having this overlord infrastructure.
Yeah.
And I think that is going to be a massive shift for humanity.
I agree.
Governments are killing us. They created COVID. I mean, it is really a mess right now. And the truth is all coming out now.
Yeah.
Do we need this anymore? And that's what really makes me question. And is the cycle, this reset that comes up, and are we going to have one soon? I believe we will. And is this cycle just part and parcel of what this breathing in and breathing out cycle of humanity's arc really is, right? Along its own hero's journey to find itself. And I think that a lot of these mysteries are going to get revealed to us,
of course,
in this process, because we're not the first to do this.
It's the time, though, Robert. It's as we move into a different age, you can't argue against it because it's already been set in place. We are entering into the age of Aquarius, and there's nothing that can stop that. The stars have commanded it, and our alignments have commanded it. So that age is going to come along with a very different energy than the age of Pisces had. And Pisces was actually quite negative. And I think that the ages always balance themselves out. That's the concepts of, duality and the constants of the yin and yang, and that all of those is that we're in a cycle of going from what was largely a negative age in Pisces to what will be overwhelming, I think, a very positive age in Aquarius. And I think that's why these great mysteries
It's also a rebellious age.
Well, but that's what comes with it, is when you have a higher level of consciousness occurring in a society, it has to morph and move away from whatever was constrained and controlling it before. It's going to naturally evolve into something different. And I think we are entering into a new golden age. And I think that's why all of these mysteries that we're exploring are happening and availing themselves right now.
It's interesting you say that, because at Burning Man, they had an event that they don't normally have. There was a woman I was at Camp Mystic, and her name's Dream Rockwell. And her 11-year-old son died during COVID. And it was because of malpractice and a bunch of stuff related to what was going on at that time, right? Which was a whole lot of mess, right? And so they had this big play, this huge play, and I helped to contribute to, finance it. And this huge play was really the story of mankind and how they officially invited in the Golden Age, right? It was New Earth.
Right.
And it was beautiful. I was like, and everyone was there from the play. It was like huge.
Yeah.
And it was so amazing to watch this, because here we are in, 2024. And I think all of us this year know this election is going to be wild, right? It's going to be wild. Who knows what's going to happen?
I try to separate myself from all of that.
Buckle in. I do too.
Yeah.
I'm not someone who's, I was going to vote for RFK, right? Which was like, my way of just sort of my own silent rebellion type of thing. And then now he dropped out. So obviously, I have to ask myself the question, what will I end up doing as a result of that, or if anything at all? But the point is that I believe humanity is capable of so much more.
Yes. We're on the brink right now.
We are on the edge of being able to go into a golden age. I truly, absolutely believe that.
Yeah.
And I think that what we're finding with this, and part of understanding the golden age, is understanding where we've been.
Yeah.
So we can understand where in the heck we need to go.
Exactly.
And where we want to go.
Exactly.
And I think that's what we're learning through this cycle of time. That the things that you're uncovering, the things that I've been uncovering, the fact that the Great Pyramid, I am convinced, is literally the spiritual ascension stargate that is actually a clock, that works like a clock. And that we can see exactly what's been happening through this long cycle of time that we were not aware of before.
Yeah.
And now we're becoming nascently aware of it. And I think all the things that you're finding in Turkey now and in ancient Acadia and Sumer, I think are all going to point us in this exact same direction. I think we're going to find the same thing is true in Peru.
Yes.
I think we're going to find, I've been finding it also in Brazil, right? Which is, I think incredible. You go to some of these megalithic sites like Ollantay Tambo and Sacsayhuaman, you could literally see, as well as Machu Picchu, you could see where there was an ancient structure that was built on top of, right? Many times, because they've got these very, very large block constructions that then go to like bricks almost.
And the classical Inca could only use like a brick and mortar. They didn't have the capacity, the capabilities to be able to create massive megalithic structures and move them and put them in place. In fact, none of the cultures that are even from the time periods that we're told, I think, could even do those things.
Yeah, like Egypt and Saqqara and Osirian and everything.
Yeah.
These are places that got repurposed through time.
And that's, I think, the biggest thread that is going to be challenged with current archaeology and current history, is looking at our past and saying, is everything following a more of like a cyclical rise and fall rather than a completely linear gradualism? As things escalate and increase technologically in sophistication, we have to really look back and say, well, were our ancestors more advanced and sophisticated in some ways than we are? And when I say ancestors, I don't even mean the people necessarily within the last 12,000 years. I'm talking about before that, when we had a very solid reset all across the planet, where it seems like most of the survivors were more of the indigenous people that were already living off of the earth, which is why I think we see such a primitive building that occurred after with these cultures. And I'll give you an example. You brought up Machu Picchu. I think that's perfect. Imagine the Inca never said they created Machu Picchu, which they don't. They don't say that. And nor do the Inca say they created things like Sacsayhuaman. That was a center. Sacsayhuaman is right around the center of Cusco, which was the center of their civilization. But what you find is that, like, go back to Machu Picchu for a minute. Look at a situation where the Inca built very primitive brick and mortar on top. That's all they did everywhere, right? Giant terraces with brick and mortar. Mm-hmm. Well, you can imagine an advanced culture living and visiting Machu Picchu as an ancient temple and its alignments to the different solstices and everything, right? Various different astrological reasons for things. But imagine them all getting wiped out. And then the people that live in the Amazon that are already surviving off the land are the ones who survive these younger Dryas and older Dryas events, and then they go up and find the remnants of these and they try to incorporate it, but they only can do bits and pieces. It'd be like children finding a bunch of adult things like technology and not understanding how to use them and trying to almost mimic them. I think what we're seeing is evidence around the world of an entire forgotten, lost civilization around the world that was wiped out, and then we were essentially reset back to the Stone Age. And it was people that were more primitive, living off the land, that found a lot of these things, but really didn't know how to use them very well or utilize them. Knew they were important places, tried to learn what they could off the pieces, but they never could recreate anything that the other cultures did. And that's why we look for these telltale signs of their presence. And those telltale signs are very specific type of stonemasonry that's highly refined, highly advanced, which has been put in place that is always on the lowermost foundations of these structures. And in most cases, they look like they're severely destroyed, where you don't have tall structures left. It's only the bases of them left, like a giant wave going through or something, washing everything away, and then having just the remnants at these bases. And that's what we're finding, of course, at Ionis and Chavos Tepe and others. But it tells us this entire story that we have forgotten, that we don't remember anymore about who we were. That's why I think when I say statements like, I think that these sites and this knowledge may be part of us entering in a golden age, but because I think once we realize that we were in one, and we knew all the things that we knew and how divine we are, I think it's what is a big catalyst that helps usher us into a new one. Because right now, I think what is lacking the most in our society is a connection to something higher.
100%.
It's fear-based, destroying people in this lower vibrational frequency state, keeping them in that place of watch out, what's going to happen? You're not anything significant. And then you keep them in this little bubble, not realizing that we once were grand civilizations that had the knowledge of literally the entire cosmos.
Yeah.
And I don't even think that Ionis was a temple just to here. I think it was a temple of the pillars of essentially like creation.
Yeah.
And to the universe, because Earth and humans are microcosms of the macrocosm. We simply are a small piece of the greater whole. And that's why it's always represented through our process of ascension and our path. It's like the growth, it's like the breathing in and out of the universe, like you said. It's the cycles, right?
Yeah.
It's beautiful. That's what we're exploring, Robert. We're exploring some of the greatest mysteries
I mean,
of all time.
I think that mankind has individually and collectively forgotten who we are.
we were supposed to. It's like we were handed the keys.
Yeah, we're supposed to. I think that's part of the cycle. I think it's part of I believe it's a simulation that's emergent from mind.
Of course.
And that we have forgotten that the whole reason why we're here is just to learn how to love and how to be loved.
And to remember who we once were and who we are.
Right. And that includes the sovereignty. And I don't think we need, that's why I'm saying, I think that we're on the precipice right now, especially in the age of Aquarius, going into Aquarius, which has a very strong rebel streak.
Yeah.
That goes through
It's
it.
supposed to. It has to.
It has to.
It's encoded into it.
It's encoded into it. And
Yeah.
I think that's why we've got so much tumult right now, that we are going through this cycle where it seems like all the institutions that would tell us what is truthful, what's not truthful, what is lawful, what's not lawful, what is moral and what's amoral. All of those structures and strictures are collapsing.
Yes.
Right now. And I've been asked the last few years to speak at United Nations at the CEO Summit. And I'm not going to go this year because I've already done it the last few years. But I just got invited to go to Davos. Now, a lot of people would say, why the heck are you going to go to the WEF, right? And World Economic Forum. And people say to me all the time, why did you go to speak at the Vatican? Well, it's like, where would I not listen? You want to know where I wouldn't go and speak? Let me ask another question. Where would I go and not listen?
Right.
Right? So, and it should have symmetry between the two.
Yeah.
So I've been to speak at the Vatican a few times as well, and they listen. And I'll probably end up going to Davos this year, which I know I'm going to get a lot of hate from people for going. But the reason I'm going is because I'm not going to go and just talk about these things to the people that everyone agrees with already. I have to be able to go and speak to the rest of the people who might not agree at all.
Well, who's going to represent us, Robert, if you don't go?
Exactly. So, and there's a lot of stuff that's been going on with this, with this WEF. And I think it's really, really important that someone actually represents a different way of looking at the world. And I spoke at United Nations and I got up and said, how many of you here think that the world still needs more overlords? To a room full of overlords.
Wow. Very bold of you, Robert.
And I'll do the exact same thing at WEF.
Well, we need that. I appreciate you pushing the limit here, the potential of what we can be.
And I think it's such a larger story. We're not just like digging up stuff that doesn't matter.
Yeah.
We're digging up stuff that is determining how we perceive our expansion in the future. I mean, if we think about it, I truly believe that our level of consciousness can only expand to the volume of the cage of our own belief systems.
Well, because we're a collective.
That's right. So our expectations become a reality. If we think we can or we think we can't, we'll be right.
Yeah, because that's how the collective breathes and understands and sees. It's like we're a giant organism. And that's why I mentioned things like what we're exploring is that when humanity needs something to care about the ancient past. If you talk to someone, they're like, well, it's great that the ancients were doing all this cool stuff, and how's that going to help me? I want to bridge that. I want to bridge where the average person says, how is this of any interest to me? Well, it truly shows us the path of that we were once divine and that we can be divine again. We can be better. We can realize our potential of who we really are. And I think that these symbols and motifs encoded in these temples and the teachings within them are there to remind us at the right time, like a time capsule, right? Open it up and you're like, wow, I didn't know we were all of this. I didn't know we had all of this. Potential is it comes back into our lives again because we're merging into another golden age and it's time. Everything's timed, Robert. It's all part of a cycle. And give you an example, you're following things like the design of the Ionis temple. They're called Susi temples. You're going to be exploring with me.
Yeah,
and the design itself looks very similar to the Omega design in the ends in the Greek alphabet. And furthermore, we find things like griffins shown as protectors in places like the Kef box relief, and the griffin was one of the primary symbols in Greece, and on and so on. And I'm giving you some more examples. We're tracing this symbol of a T-pillar that has 3 levels within it. That seems to be a teaching of totality that I uncovered these artifacts. They were sticking out barely out of the grass at Shavuos Tepe.
Pillar with 3
indentations of levels within it. So the T
on the
top,
lines coming down.
inside it, there's another base of the T-pillar within it, and then another base within it. So there's 3 levels that emerge, like the totality of a 3. It's the teaching of 3.
You know, that is very tightly symbolized with Thoth. That's
Right.
a triple tau.
And that's exactly what you're seeing the motif all across this are doorways, triptych doorways with 3 doors, like Da Vinci showed with the Last Supper,
Mm-hmm.
as well as taking that totality of teaching
The
into a
triple
single symbol.
Oh, wow.
And now that symbol that we see at Shavuos Tepe and on the Kef box relief that formulates some of the main basis behind their teachings of their like connections to higher conscious place and higher doorways to like the knowledge of the universe, right? We then go to Menorca, Spain, which you'll be going as well, and you find the exact same T-pillar, even with an indentation in the back that sticks out, showing the levels. And of course, in Menorca, Spain, one of the few places I think that's really been explored adequately as well, you have the largest T-pillars in the world, bigger than Göbekli Tepe. The ones at Menorca are way more. They're 60 tons in Menorca.
Wow.
16 feet tall, 60 tons. Now, you have a Teotihuacan culture that was in that region that built primitive stuff all around it, and that's what archaeologists think built those. But then you have these bedrock areas with these massive T-pillars that look exactly like the same, I call it the divine T-pillar we're seeing at around Lake Van and in these artifacts is now in the Mediterranean sticking up, and is like a completely mysterious history that nobody knows who built it.
Have you been to Malta yet?
Not yet. And then Malta is going to be connected too, because the Hypogeum in Malta
Yes.
has the same connections back to like the Maltese cross and the elongated skulls that we see genetically that come back to the Ararat region. It just keeps getting deeper
Well,
and deeper.
and the T. You know, the doorways, all the doorways in Malta, you know, are all like double and triple tau.
And that's what we're getting at. But it gets even deeper, Robert, because then you follow that. There's a stepped pyramid design with a doorway symbol, okay, as well as the T. And you go to South America. You go from Turkey to Menorca, the same thing. Then you go to South America. You go to Pumapunku and Tiwanaku and Ollantaytambo,
Yeah.
and you have the exact same symbol
Same
carved
stuff.
in, exact same symbol. Then you take the H blocks
Yeah, the
that are
H-blocks.
at Pumapunku.
Pumapunku. Right.
And then
I
you
was
go
just
to the
thinking that.
temple of Horus in Edfu,
Mhm.
and you see that the entire temple has been designed with that exact same
Exact
shape.
same thing. Right.
And you're like, whoa. So this is all connected.
Well, yeah. I mean, here's another one, right? It's like the height of Menkaure Pyramid is 216 feet. The base width of the Great Pyramid is 756 feet. The base width of the Pyramid of the Sun in Teotihuacan is 756 feet. The height of the same pyramid is 216 feet. The base width of the Pyramid of the Moon in Teotihuacan is 481 feet.
Yeah.
That's the exact height of the Great Pyramid.
It's like they mimicked the Great Pyramids of Giza across the world at Teotihuacan
Yeah.
to be like either end, to do similar functions. And of course, we know that when they excavated down, they found tunnels and chambers under the temple of Quetzalcoatl
Yeah.
that had liquid mercury and all of these different components of energetic functions with subterranean chambers with water flowing,
Mhm.
which is just like the Great Pyramid of Giza, which, by the way, we have subterranean areas we're going to be exploring under Ionis as well. It gets
Okay.
really
I'm
interesting.
excited for this trip. So tell us about your book with Billy and what you're up to next besides this cool film that you're going to make.
Yeah, so I released back in January. I released a book I co-authored with Billy Carson called "The Epic of Humanity," in which we told this epic of our story from all the tablets and translations of all the ancient stories and the evidence left behind of who we were and what happened to us, what we lived through, what we experienced. You know, the rise of golden ages and the destruction of our culture in our world. Really, essentially, and like. My good friend Randall Carlson, he talks about how if we look at the Northern Hemisphere during the Younger Dryas, 40 million megafauna died of extinction instantly. like that from Younger Dryas catastrophes. So if we're looking at the types of events that were occurring during that, it is absolutely catastrophic in some parts of the world. Let me give you an example, a place you're going called Kefkalesi. Incredibly important artifact called the Kefkalesi box relief came from there. But you're going to be investigating these massive basalt buttress pillars that match Ionis that have extreme vitrification all across them. I counted 24 areas that show, you see these basalt blocks of volcanic stone that has been melted in the top, completely melted to turn into glass.
Wow.
From extreme events that hit in certain places. Now, why are those areas so affected? I think it was because of magnetism, because they're highly magnetic rocks that were in these energetic spots that, like Robert Schoch going on this trip, we're exploring whether or not some of these events are related to coronal mass ejections, plasma events.
Yeah, of course.
And how those places would be severely affected. You can imagine areas of the atmosphere opening up because you're getting a weakening of the poles and a movement of the poles during these massive sun events that are shifting and wobbling things around. And you get holes that open up, and you literally would get thousands of lightning strikes in an instant in some places.
Well, it's the only thing that can make sense of a lot of what we're experiencing, like when we go to Karnak.
Yeah.
There are temples that were adjacent to Karnak.
Yeah.
They were completely destroyed into a million bits.
Yes.
And then you've got other things that were completely left unscathed. What happened?
It looks like specific areas had holes open up that were more affected than others. Because what we're seeing is that specifically on certain energetic structures, they have the most damage. We're still finding a black matter around the world that shows that there was catastrophes all around the planet, but it seems to impact different regions differently. And that's why we're exploring whether or not, like this Ararat civilizations that we're looking into in Eastern Turkey, whether they were, I think they were completely, evidence is showing that they were completely wiped out from catastrophes that are related to this, but not after the fact that they had traveled and traversed around the world and helped create what I think was the Golden Age, because I'm tracing sites like Altan Tepe is a brand new one I've never talked about, 425 miles away. Exact same temple, same Susi design, Omega design, same stones, same 3-pillar entryway to get in, exactly the same thing, but it's 425 miles away. I mean, that is astronomical for a civilization to have that. And it shows you they were migrating, they were moving. They were moving westward. What do you have just west of that area? The Black Sea's north of it, and the Mediterranean's just west of it. Which is why I believe they became a great maritime civilization, then travel all around the world. Because when we look at Lake Van, and I don't know if you know, Robert, but Lake Van is over 1,000 feet deep. One of the deepest lakes in the world. Lake Titicaca is over 1,000 feet deep too, surrounded by volcanoes. Lake Van is surrounded by volcanoes. Mount Sufan right above it. There's these, it's like they were creating sister places in other parts of the world, like something that mimicked exactly what they had here, mimic here, like Tehuacan mimicking Egypt or something. And I think that's what we're finding with these parallels in these locations that are connected to the same symbols, the same teachings, the same stonework.
I also think we're going to find Orion correlations all over the place.
Oh, without a doubt, because the three, again, this concept of the trimurti, or this concept, the triptych, and this concept of three, which I think means many things, right? Pillars of creation, pathways of divinity and ascension, like with Da Vinci and all these things, but also the microcosm of the macrocosm of being connected to Orion. The three primary stars of Orion's belt. I think it's all connected, right? The Hermetic law of correspondence, Robert, right? As
Absolutely. As above, so below. And I think there's a Orion's gate portal, and that's where a lot of the esoteric and wisdom teachings take us, is that we come through this Orion's belt before we come here as human beings. And it's the through the
souls, right?
Exactly, the path of the souls.
And that so the earth is, like you're saying, is the earth looks like it's some kind of a universe teaching school for souls here.
It's what it is.
Right? And that leads us to,
it's the coolest school ever, but it's hell until you realize it's a cool school.
talk about the polarity dynamic that exists here, huh?
Oh yeah. Yeah, it's like, suffering is just suffering when it has no meaning and context. But when we understand the reason for suffering is the divine path,
Exactly. And we are going to be exploring some of the greatest mysteries of humanity, Robert. And it's an honor to have you
I'm
with your
honored.
knowledge and wisdom and experience to go to these incredibly important places and see if we can crack these codes together.
I'm super excited. This is going to be really epic. How can people find you if they want to learn more about you?
People can find me, and all this information about the trip is on thestageoftime.com on my website, or on my YouTube channel. It's Matthew LaCroix. Instagram is The Stage of Time. And I'm in the middle of writing my 4th book called The Missing Key of History, on these connections in this civilization and all the stuff we're doing right now. So I'm in the middle of all of this, and we're getting everything ready for getting out to Turkey, Menorca, and eventually South America to connect all this.
Totally.
But we will have future expeditions even outside the documentary that will go to places like the Temple of Horus in Edfu, and in even connections we have in like Saudi Arabia and India and all of these places. So it's going to keep getting bigger and bigger, but it's an honor to have you a part of it, Robert. I can't wait to explore these with you.
My honor, brother. Great. Such a pleasure to have you here. I'm super excited to go on this adventure with you. Until next week, have a wonderful week, everyone, and we'll see you next time on Think Tank.